Hey, thanks for listening to Dragon Wagon Radio. If you're enjoying this show, check out DragonWagonShop.com and get yourself some sweet merch while supporting your favorite indie podcast network. That's DragonWagonShop.com.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to another exciting episode of Don't Quill the Messenger with one of our favorite guests returning to us today. You know her. Most of you have read her book. She is Elizabeth Winkler, the famed author and journalist, and we're so glad to have her back with us for this episode to talk about what's been happening with her book and the new paperback that is coming out very soon, as well as some other projects that we're going to try to tease out of her if we can during the episode. Elizabeth, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Stephen. Great to be back.
Yeah, since our last episode together with the publication of your book, you have been on quite a busy schedule. I'm sure touring all over the place, promoting the book, making appearances. How's that been going for you?
Oh, it's been an interesting experience. This is my first book, so the whole book publication journey was new to me. Yeah, I've been doing events at bookstores, libraries, private clubs, several universities, wherever people want me to speak, and lots of podcasts as well. So it's been a lot of fun, and it's just fun hearing from readers, watching them discover the book and seeing their reactions to it. There was just a book influencer on YouTube who I didn't even know put out some video a week or so ago describing the book as the best thriller she'd ever read, and it was a fun surprise to watch that. So, it's been a lot of fun.
Well, that is exciting because I don't know that I would call it a thriller, but definitely it reads to some degree as sort of a mystery novel because it's about such a compelling mystery. And for those listening, if you're not familiar, we sometimes take for granted that everybody knows what we're talking about. But the title of the book is Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies. It is by Elizabeth Winkler. And the new paperback version is due to hit bookstores April 23rd. Is that correct?
That is right. April 23rd in the US, and I believe it's May 23rd in the UK, 1 month later.
So in the UK, they were like, no, that is too close to Shakespeare's birthday, and so we don't want to release it for another month. Is that what happened?
There's just always a delay between US publication and UK publication. That with most books, there's like a slight, they don't come out at quite the same time.
It is interesting, though, that it is timed here in the U.S. to very close to what is identified as, Shakespeare's birthday.
Yeah, it's about a year since the hardback came out. About a year later, spring publication. Tuesdays are often book publication days, and April 23rd happens to fall on a Tuesday this year. So that was just the date my publisher selected.
Well, before we talk about that process, and because I'm really curious, as a prospective author, I have a book sitting, waiting to be published that I'm going to finish someday. So I'm curious about that process and how that all works and some of the inner workings of publishing. But before we talk about that, I want to throw out a personal endorsement and shameless plug. I think, folks, if you're listening, this is the perfect book to give as a gift to friends or family members who are curious about this issue. If you're involved, or even if you're just a part-time listener to the show, you're a member of the Quiller Nation, but you're not a committed, devout follower of Oxfordianism, or you're just curious about the mystery and it's one of 18 million other podcasts that you listen to, whatever your level of involvement is in this, if you've ever talked about it with anybody who has asked you about it, this is the book to give them. And now that there's going to be a paperback version available, you can give a very inexpensive, very handy gift to anybody on your list who you think might be more interested in the mystery. It does not sell any candidate. Elizabeth is a very objective journalist, and the book takes that fabulous approach, which it's one of the reasons why I think it's so effective at introducing people to what's going on with this topic. And so I encourage you, go to your online book purchase location, whether that's Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever, Abbey Books, wherever you buy your books online, go online, pre-order paperbacks now. That way, when they're released, you will have them in your hot little hands to give away as gifts. That's what I intend to do.
Well, thank you for that plug, Stephen.
And I mean it.
I appreciate it. Pre-orders do help authors a lot if you pre-order the book before it comes out, because that's how bookstores decide, how many to order, how many to have in stock. So it is really helpful.
So then to add another layer to that, if you have a local bookstore, and I know that those are such a dying breed, unfortunately, in the world, but if you actually have a local bookstore that you like, do the bookstore a favor, do yourself a favor, go to the bookstore, ask them to pre-order copies, and then they get a little bit and they get some flow through their store, as well as you're introducing them a little bit to the authorship mystery as a topic that maybe they could start a section in their store. It's a win all the way around. So go out there and get your pre-orders in. It also helps Elizabeth.
And I should add, the paperback has a bit of added material that wasn't in the hardback version of the book. So it has an epilogue that I've added, sort of reflecting on the whole history of the topic and the controversy. And then it also has a selected bibliography. In addition to, the hardback had the 45 pages of endnotes with all the bibliographic citations. But then if you want just like a reading list of books, there's that added as well.
Now, when that's a great question that I'm curious about. When you're making those decisions, whether you're going to add something, or I suppose there are sometimes when there are actually corrections that maybe need to be made, or there's been a misprint or something. Have you noticed any of that kind of editing necessary? And then how do you decide what it needs? Is that part of working with the publisher? Is that your decision? How does that play out in the end, that, okay, here are the parts that needed to be changed, fixed, or added before the paperback is released?
Oh, I mean, it's just a personal decision. Some people put out a paperback that's identical to their hardback. Some people add a whole chapter of material. Sometimes people add like questions for a book club discussion, or, it's whatever you think readers would enjoy. I realized that readers wanted like a reading list of more books to delve into the subject. And that even though I have all the books listed in the endnotes, reading through all those notes is a little bit cumbersome. So I thought a list would make things easier. Then you can also just look and see like what some of the major texts were that I was drawing on, both orthodox and unorthodox. And then the epilogue it's actually something I'd wanted to have in there before, but there was like a kerfuddle with pages, basically, like they couldn't fit it in before publication last time. So the epilogue is something if you've listened to the book on audio or the Kindle version, the epilogue's actually in there, but it wasn't in the hardback. So it's been added in the paperback. Sometimes it's just, frustrations with the printing process, and, it's still a bit cumbersome the way, you have pages in like 16 counts or something. And anyway, I've learned a lot about the whole printing process through this. But
how tight has your schedule been in promoting the book throughout the year, and what does the new schedule look like with regards to promoting the paperback? Is that keeping you pretty busy? Are you flying all over the country and all over the world? How's that been working out?
Well, I'm not flying all over the place. I mean, book tours have changed pretty significantly since COVID. Bookstores stopped having in-person events then, and they moved to Zoom. So a lot of stuff now is virtual. And, it's not necessarily worth your time to fund a ton of travel, because, you fly somewhere and then 20 or 30 people come to a book event, it's not in the publisher's interest to, they don't get enough of a return on that. So book tours have changed a lot, but I'm doing as many events as I can, and I do events wherever people ask me to speak, and if they want to sponsor me to travel, then of course I'm happy to come. So I'll be doing an event in New York Public Library on April 30th, in conversation with Mark Rylance, which should be a fun event if you're in New York. I'll be doing some stuff in London later in late May, early June. And beyond that, speaking at some clubs, a few virtual things. So, but the book's out there. I sort of return to my regular life now of writing articles and reviews and essays. So you can't promote a book forever. It's out in the world and it has legs of its own, and people are discovering it, and I sort of let it venture forth.
Well, and one of the things that I have always appreciated about you, and I'm sure this is probably still true. I mean, obviously now it's easier for me because we've developed a friendship over the last year and a half or so, but you're so easily accessible. And I say that so that people, if there are anybody listening who has a group or would like to contact you about trying to help promote the book for their group or their area or some club they're involved in, it's very easy to contact Elizabeth through her website and through email. And you might want to reach out. You never know. She might be around where you're going to be. She might be willing to do a Zoom with your reading club. You never know. It never hurts to ask, right, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'm happy to join via Zoom for book clubs. I've done a number of those. And I've joined locally when there's book groups in my area that are reading the book. That's a lot of fun. So yeah, no, I'm happy to be present if I can.
I really liked what you just said earlier about some authors will include like a list of discussion topics for a book club. And I'm wondering if would be some benefit. I'd like to see what your list of discussion topics would be. So I'm wondering if you could post those somewhere like on your website so that then people who do have a book club and decide to pitch this as one for everyone in their group to read. And then wouldn't it be cool to have discussion topics provided by the author herself for you to kind of bounce around the room after everybody in your group has read the book?
Yeah, actually, publishers usually commission those guides to be written by some outside person, like instead of by the author.
Oh, really?
So I think, yeah, interestingly. So I think Simon & Schuster has someone writing up a study guide or like a question guide. And I can try and get that out there.
That's cool. So tell me, because this is the way my mind thinks. So I want you to tell me, like, what has been the worst moment throughout the process? I mean, we can get to some of the better moments, and that's great that you shared one already with the book influencer who's like, oh, great thriller, and that was a fun surprise. But I want to hear about like the nitty gritty, nuts and bolts ugliness. Did you ever walk into a room full of people who are like, this book sucks, or arms folded and crossed because of the subject matter, the whole taboo of it all?
I never did. No. It's very easy for people to be nasty online when they're just staring into a screen and tapping on their computer. And of course, there was a lot of online nastiness via Twitter and, some attack articles, that kind of thing. And I did wonder when I was starting off promoting the book last year, if I was going to encounter that at my in-person events. And of course, that was I was sort of bracing myself for how I would respond to that. But it never happened. Everyone who showed up was incredibly supportive and enthusiastic and interested. There were sometimes people in the audience who would ask questions, perhaps challenging things, or they would say, I'm a Stratfordian and I'm wondering about this, but they were always perfectly polite and courteous. I think, people, it's hard to be mean to someone in person when you're looking at someone's face, and, it's really an interesting change in the dynamic when people get together in person. They don't feel like they can be rude and nasty and vicious the way they can be when they're hiding behind their screens.
Well, I'm grateful that is true. It would be nice if people didn't feel that the screen separation gave them carte blanche to just bang away like a keyboard warrior and say all kinds of crazy crap. Unfortunately, the era that we're in of the internet and social media has really kind of opened that door to some of the dark side of humanity, I say. But it's good to know that they keep it in check when they're actually in person or in the room and there aren't, hecklers or protesters showing up just to try to ruin your day.
Yeah. Yeah. I was pleasantly surprised by that. I think probably people who hate the book or, whatever, I think they just don't show up, which is fine.
When you talk about, these, and I don't mean the like internet trolls who are posting anonymously away from their basement or whatever, but what about the actually, known critics or book reviewers? How has that gone? And what kind of book reviews are out there that we could point listeners to if they're curious to see what some of these critics have had to say about the book?
Well, there's a whole range of them, and a number of them are quoted on my website and on the Simon & Schuster site. I mean, I didn't know how the book was going to be received, and I was really sort of delighted by a lot of the very positive reception. The Guardian ran a great review of it. The New Statesman in the UK had, for these British publications, which you would think would be much more committed to orthodoxy, very positive things to say. It was funny. I mean, as a writer, you're so close to the material, you can't really see it from an outside perspective. So it's fun. What was fun for me was to see the different ways people perceived the book. Some talked about it as having the pull of detective fiction. That was one sort of take on it. Another one called it a fascinating indictment of incurious scholars. Another review referred to it as entertaining as a comedy of manners about academic scholarship, with characters straight out of a Philip Roth campus novel. So I
actually like both of those last two. Those are both actually really good.
So it's just fun to see the different. Everyone pulls different things out of it. So it's just a pleasure to watch the ways different people interpret it and think about it.
Well, did any
I can go through the reviews if you want, but I mean, I don't know if that's tedious to read through my reviews.
I was just curious about, some of your favorite comments about it. And then the other curiosity I have is, were any of the characters in the book, I know it's funny, that last one that you just mentions the quote unquote characters in the book, which are all real life people. How have any of them responded? Have you had any... what did Garber have to say? What did Greenblatt have to say? What did anybody, have you heard from Shapiro? Like, what's going on with the quote unquote characters in the book?
I have not heard from Garber or Greenblatt. I sent them both copies of the book with, just with a note thanking them for speaking with me. So they have it. I have no idea if they read it or, I don't know. Jonathan Bate, who I never met with in the book, although I mention him and his work numerous times, he responded in some of the British papers about the book. And he made a bit of a fool of himself with claims like Shakespeare didn't know Venice has canals and sort of nonsensical things like that, even though the plays mention gondolas. So, that's kind of typical of his way of engaging. Stanley Wells blocked me on Twitter the other day, which I found very amusing. I guess that's his response. Okay. I guess he's annoyed at me.
It took him a while, huh?
What?
It took him a while. I mean, I know he's old, but that's a really delayed reaction, isn't it?
Well, it seemed to be because there was a review of his book. He wrote this new book, What Was Shakespeare Really Like? There was a review of it in the TLS, the Times Literary Supplement, not by me, but by another Shakespeare scholar who, criticized and highlighted a number of the flaws in the book. And the article was titled Phantom Shakespeare. sort of the phantom author, and talked about the unknowability of Shakespeare, which all sounds quite funny if you're clued in about the authorship debate.
Mm-hmm.
So all I did was I congratulated the writer of that review on like a smart and interesting article. And I guess the fact that I was complimenting him on his review pissed Stanley Wells off, and then he blocked me. So anyway,
that's great.
The petty
so glad.
the petty squabbles are quite amusing, aren't they?
Yes, they indeed they are, and especially from people like him and Bate, who are just notorious. I suppose Shapiro has been silent, but he falls into that crazy camp of, like, I'd call them like the triumvirate of orthodoxy, those three guys, and they are very humorous.
Yeah, I mean, James Shapiro, I'm sure he doesn't want to draw any attention to the book. So, in a way, the more they attack it, the more attention they draw to it. And perhaps they've inadvertently helped the book become a bit more prominent by attacking it. So I imagine he's trying to just ignore it and hope it goes away. But that doesn't quite seem to be happening.
Sometimes I feel like once you dive into this topic, it can become, this black hole of endless interest and query. And I know that a lot of the listeners probably feel that way. I know many of them have written to me and tell me about their growing library of books on this issue. And I know some of them have written to me and talked about rabbit holing YouTube videos that are out there, that we have different creators on the topic who produce some really good stuff. And it's very easy to, get sucked in and spend several hours watching their videos of their research. Have you found yourself sort of drawn into this more, or have you done any additional research? Has your, journalist's investigative mind sort of kept you curious to dig deeper, find out more during the last year? Or is it really just, okay, I've put that one to bed and now I'm moving on to the next thing other than promoting this book?
Well, I have moved on in the sense that I'm writing about lots of other topics in literature and the arts. But of course, I'm interested in the authorship question and will continue to follow the research. And I'm following the work published by both Stratfordians and anti-Stratfordians. I'm interested in the research being done by Roger Strittmatter, who published an article in the Orthodox Journal Critical Survey last fall, arguing that Shakespeare was identified as Oxford's pen name in 1598. So that's an interesting bit of research he published. And then he has a forthcoming article on the Audley End annotations, which are these books of Roman history with notes in the margins. And he's publishing an article in the Journal of Forensic Document Examination, arguing that those annotations are in the hand of Oxford, and that those books and those notes are sort of his source text for writing the Roman plays Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. So that's interesting research, and I'm following that. And the fact that it's being published in mainstream journals is a pretty interesting development. So I'm eager to see how all of that's received. And then I'm always interested in the books that are being put out by Orthodox Shakespeareans as well. There's one coming out this spring from Stephen Greenblatt called, it's about Shakespeare and Freud. It's called Second Chances, Shakespeare and Freud. And it's about how they both thought about the human capacity for renewal. And so I got a hold of a copy of it. As a reviewer, you can get early copies of books before they came out. And I thought, okay, Shakespeare and Freud, interesting. I wonder what they have to say here. It's by Stephen Greenblatt and Adam Phillips, who's a lead sort of psychotherapist and interpreter of Freud. And so I was curious to see what they have to say about Freud's views on Shakespeare's identity. And I searched through the entire thing, and they never once, not even in a footnote, mentioned that, oh, by the way, Freud thought Shakespeare was actually someone else. So that to me is kind of jaw-dropping, as it's regardless of whether you think Freud was right, you sort of have a responsibility as a scholar, if you're writing an entire book on Shakespeare and Freud, to mention that small detail. So I think it's a really interesting example of the intellectual dishonesty that goes on there, and also of a kind of self-censorship. People say, oh, the authorship question isn't taboo. It's just nonsense. No, it's definitely taboo. Look, they're not even mentioning it here in a place where they should be at least acknowledging it in some form. So that's quite striking to me. And then there's a second book coming out, an essay collection called On the Couch, Writers on Freud. So it's a whole essay collection of different writers commenting on Freud. And you would think in a book about writers on Freud, and there's mention of Shakespeare in it, and Freud drew heavily on Shakespeare. Harold Bloom talks about how important Shakespeare was to Freud's work, and then that book too doesn't mention anything about Oxford or Freud's views on Shakespeare's identity. So just watching some of those books come out and seeing how they dance around the authorship question is quite interesting to me.
We see
there's
that,
always new.
We see that so often.
Sorry, go ahead.
Throughout all of this quote unquote scholarship is the cherry picking that goes on, and unfortunately, admittedly, to be intellectually honest, it happens on both sides of the aisle. Because you do have those who are skeptics of authorship who come across something in their research that's uncomfortable or doesn't fit the narrative they're looking for, and they'll just gloss over it, ignore it, or pretend it doesn't exist, the same as Stratfordians do. So it's very interesting to watch and see these moments where scholars choose, like is mentioned in your book, this sort of position of, well, the fun thing about Shakespeare is he is whatever I want him to be. And, the Stratfordians, bait can make him brilliant in all these areas, but ignorant of all these areas to fit whatever the narrative. He didn't even know there were canals in Venice type of stuff, right? And then on the other hand, you have somebody like Greenblatt going, oh, Freud was so influenced by Shakespeare, and he was such the father of psychiatry, and he saw Shakespeare as being integral to the understanding of the human and all of that. But there are other people who would tell you Freud was crazy off of his ass, and will point to sometimes his doubts about Shakespeare authorship as proof that he was a nut. So, it's kind of the way that people choose to either prop up a source or tear it down based on whatever conclusions they're looking to achieve has always plagued this issue, I think, for eternity, and continues to do so on both sides of the aisle.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
It's one of the reasons why I enjoy your perspective so much, because it is so objective, and it does come from a place of true journalistic inquest rather than diving into it with the idea already preconceived. You and the book is wonderful in that way too. I know I've said this before, but it is your journey through it all, and you kind of just let it all fall where it fell. You went on the journey, and whatever came before you, you commented on and you revealed and shared. And it doesn't ever feel like you are picking and choosing what to include or not include when you're sharing your experience with the reader through the book. And I think that's what makes it such a compelling book to read, and why you've received some of the great reviews that you have about how, it's a very readable book. I don't know if that's a word. I don't know if anybody has called it that, but that's what I say.
Even Emma Smith called it readable.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that was the biggest challenge with it. How do you make a subject that is so full of academic scholarship and history and literary analysis also fun and readable? Because I didn't want to lose the reader along the way. But, it's interesting that you use the word objective, because I don't know that any writer can be objective. Any book is written from a certain perspective, is written by, one person. And in fact, my book is narrated very much from my point of view. I don't pretend to take on a third person omniscient voice. But the way I try to have some kind of objectivity, I guess, was by acknowledging the constant flaws in our ability to be objective, by pointing out all the ways in which we are constantly subject to our own biases and prejudices, and cherry picking and confirmation bias and all that. So it was more by opening up an awareness of that, in all the different theories and all the different people I talked to, that you sort of acknowledge the problem, the difficulty of achieving something like an objective view of history. And it's a subject historians have written about extensively and struggled with a lot, that history is ultimately, insofar as it's a narrative that people write, it's always more of an art than it is a science. And that there is not really any such thing as an objective scientific, account of history. In fact, it's always shifting and it's always being revised.
Well, it was Eric Arthur Blair who wrote History is Written by the Winners. And he put that under his pen name, George Orwell. So just a little irony there. Here's a guy writing under a pseudonym who writes this famous quote that we use that was so profound that we use it over and over again because it's so absolutely true. History is written by the winners. And so you're right. That is a very good observation. But again, that just goes to my point that that's the position you take is the observer. And I guess that's what I'm talking about when I talk about, objectivity, is you're just sharing what you find, what you see. Not that you're not placing value judgments on it, because that's part of, human experience, certainly. But you remember I've said this before, and I hold true to this. One of the things I love about the book so much is that you are the heroine of the book. And I know I have said this to you both publicly and privately. As a reader, what I've been waiting for is to follow that heroine through another story. So what is happening with that? Are you working on something for the future, whether it's a follow-up to this book or a follow-up to this book in the sense the same style of inquiry, but a totally different subject? What's going on with you?
Oh, well, I am writing articles about other subjects, and I imagine a book project will eventually evolve out of an article. I do want to write something in a similar vein insofar as I really liked the combination of interviews with literary sort of analysis and history. So I think I'll do something along those lines again, although I think I need to step out of the Shakespeare debate for a while. I'm not quite sure what the next book will be. I'm sort of mulling various projects. I'm not in any particular rush right now. But yeah, I mean, it was such an amazing experience to push myself to write a book.
Well, I think so many of us who enjoy the book, and I think everybody out there listening will agree with me, is that when we find ourselves reading book series, I read a lot of book series. I've grown up reading book series. I now am giving series of books to my children that I once read, whether those series be something like The Chronicles of Narnia or, Lord of the Rings, or, the Wrinkle in Time series. You find characters that you attach yourself to, and when the story is over, you miss that character. Sometimes we reread books because of missing that character and wanting to go through that same journey with that character again. And I think that's what lends sequels, as it were, to being sequels, is we want to experience more with the characters in the book. And when I say that you're the heroine of the book, and now we all cleave to you, the heroine, and now we want to follow the heroine through another story. And so I would argue that regardless of what that happens to be, it could be a travel guide to Italy. It could be exploration of the meanings behind the Great Pyramid at Giza. I don't know, whatever strikes your fancy. I think that everybody would agree that we'd like to follow Elizabeth Winkler through another investigation, through another exploration into something somewhere.
Well, that is very kind of you. I hope readers continue to follow my investigations. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what that's going to be right now. I'm researching a few things, but I don't want to disclose publicly yet what they might be until I've sort of settled on a project. But yeah, I'm sure I will return to the authorship debate in some form. And in part, I'm watching to see how the new research evolves. How is the new research that Roger Stritt Matters publishing, for instance, how is that received? How does that change the debate? And it's interesting, too, to watch the way the statements from Orthodox scholars are shifting a little bit here and there. I mean, there was a recent review Emma Smith wrote about various Shakespeare biographies in which she said, there's been a broad consensus about the dates of Shakespeare's plays, but that may be a self-perpetuating fiction. That was the phrase she used, rather than anything more secure. So for a long time, they were really adamant about the narrative they had come up with of the chronology of the dates. But there's a shift there now. Now she's saying that might be a fiction. There was a new statement added to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust's website about Shakespeare's signatures, the 6 signatures, and the Birthplace Trust now says there's discussion about whether those may be written by clerks involved in the preparation of the documents. So you see it's very interesting to me to watch how they are gradually making those sort of concessions and opening things up, and we'll see where the debate goes in the coming years.
I think you're right. And I think it's a really fun time to be involved in this and to be watching the landscape sort of shift. It feels like I'll use this analogy. It feels very much like a board game, sort of a conquest style board game, like Risk, maybe, where we're finding little gains here and there on the map. In this area, we're getting a little bit over here. And in this area, we're getting a little bit over there. And ultimately, I think if we stay focused on these battles, we will someday be victorious in winning this war, because they are, and I'll take the analogy a little further, they are choosing more carefully which hills they're willing to die on. And it seems to me that for a long time, the signature issue, they were adamant, like you say, they're going to die on that hill. Especially the dating of the plays. That's been a huge one where their dates have to be right, because it means that it's their guy, and those dates prove it's their guy. I have a close friend, a fellow actor and director, one of my closest friends in the world, and he has this piece of art that hangs on the wall in his house that is this chronology of the plays of Shakespeare with all these dates. And we once got into a very heated debate when I said, those are all wrong. That piece of art is just propaganda. It's all completely wrong. He was very upset by that. But now he might have to re-examine. He might take that piece of art down. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, so many of these issues are subjects of debate among Orthodox scholars themselves, James Shapiro wrote an article for LitHub last year titled "Shakespeare Was Not More Than One Person." So that goes against the entire work of the new Oxford Shakespeare, all those other scholars who have found all these other hands in the plays. So is he rejecting the work of Gary Taylor and all of his colleagues? It's they can't. What's so funny about the debate, and of course, skeptics have pointed this out all the way back to the early 20th century, is that they reject debate about the authorship, but they themselves can't agree on fundamental issues to do with Shakespeare and to do with the plays. So they can't even reach a consensus among themselves about things like the dating, the chronology, like how many people were involved in these plays, how exactly was the first folio produced, So there's a deep hypocrisy there that they won't allow, debate with skeptics.
On that topic, I always hearken back to the comments of Justice John Paul Stevens, who clearly stated that one of the big issues with this topic is that there is no well-defined narrative. And, someone with a legal mind like his who believed, and if you've ever been involved in any type of a court case, it's the closing argument that wins the day a lot of the time. And that closing argument is designed to piece together a cohesive narrative from the evidence in front of you that the jury can follow, understand, and agree upon, whether that's a murder trial or the accusation that Stratford Will was the author known as Shakespeare, or conversely, as Justice Stevens pointed out, one of the difficulties of the Oxfordian position is also no one seems to be able to agree upon the narrative. And it's been one of the biggest issues, I think, that stood in the way of the Oxfordian position is that you have too many members of the society, as it were, that can't agree on what that story is and what that narrative is. And so I think you're right. That makes a really good point about within the orthodoxy, they squabble. Within Oxfordianism, we squabble.
I mean, they don't have an agreed narrative. They don't know, every time you read a Shakespeare biography, it's a totally different version of Shakespeare's life and of the lost years and the chronology of the plays, So yes, there are divisions and competing narratives among anti-Stratfordians and Oxfordians, but they're among, Orthodox scholars as well.
This all began for you with that notorious article in The Atlantic where you theorized, and that's why the title of the book is, Shakespeare was a woman. This all began, and other heresies, yes, of course. But this began with you just writing an article speculating about the idea of Shakespeare having been written by a woman. Throughout this journey, have you found any further evidence of that? Do you see that feminine voice in the canon, or have you now discovered that actually isn't present? Or which candidates, I don't want you to tell us which candidate you believe is the writer, because I wouldn't put you on the spot like that.
Even, I'm not going to do that.
But what I would like to know is which candidates can you feel are the ones that are most easily dismissed? Because one of the things that happens a lot with this topic is people go and very dismissively will say, yeah, there are 50 different people who have been theorized as being the author, including Queen Elizabeth herself, and it's all hogwash and it's all conspiracy theory. You would have the man on the moon as Shakespeare. And I always counter and say, no, you would have the man on the moon as Shakespeare, because that story is more mythology than any of the others that I have seen. But are there any that you've come, that through this process you've gone, okay, it definitely wasn't that one and definitely wasn't that one? Do you still have any belief that Emilia Bassano was potential author? Like, that's where I'm going with it.
Oh, I see. Well, I think Roz Barber, she makes a really good point in the chapter that I interview her in the book. She says, the fact that there are so many candidates have been put forward, it doesn't mean it's all nonsense. There's so many people put forward because there's so many problems with the traditional narrative. And yes, there have been quite a number put forward, but fundamentally most of the skeptics over the years have sort of cohered around, a small group of candidates, mostly Oxford and Marlowe. In the 19th century, of course, it was Bacon, but less so today. And then Mary Sidney when she was put forward in 1931. But, I think it'd be interesting to do what's the breakdown? I mean, I would venture that 80% of anti-Stratfordians are probably Oxfordians in the world today, I would guess. I mean, I don't know exactly, but
I'm not sure that there's a way to quantify that, quite honestly.
I wouldn't know how.
And I don't know if I would.
My book reflects kind of the breakdown of interest, I guess. Like I do spend quite a bit of time on the Baconian theory because that was at one point the most popular theory, in the 19th century. Then I spend probably the most space on Oxford because that is the dominant alternative to the Stratford narrative today. He is the favorite candidate. So, and then of course there's Marlowe's in there because he's drawn a lot of interest to over the years. The female candidates continue to be interesting to me. I'm a journalist reporting on the controversy. I'm not pretending to do original research into it. I'm following the research that's being published. What remains clear to me is that there's a problem with the Stratfordian narrative when you look at the women in Shakespeare's life compared to the women of the plays. And I think that's really important to emphasize, that Anne Hathaway and Shakespeare's daughters were illiterate. They signed with a mark. One of them signed with a signature described by the director of the British Museum as painfully formed and the most she was capable of doing with a pen. So the fact that you have the women in his life were not educated, not literate, and then in the plays you have these extraordinarily intelligent, educated women. In The Tempest, Prospero is so proud of the fact that he has educated Miranda. And these women write sonnets and they read Ovid in the plays. They compose letters. So there's been an attempt now by Stratfordians to try to sort of focus on the women around Shakespeare. There's this new book out called Shakespeare's Sisters, actually by Greenblatt's wife. And the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford is doing like a whole series of talks on Shakespeare and women. But it's kind of funny to me because they're sort of talking about like women in the Renaissance who were educated and intelligent, but they're not at all acknowledging the problem with the women in Shakespeare's own life. So I think it's just that discrepancy that remains significant. Was Amelia Bassano the author of the plays? I don't make that claim or that argument. I think it's, she knew Oxford. She had a connection there. It's possible that she collaborated or had a hand in something or an influence of some sort. But, I'm reporting on the research that's being published. I'm not sort of digging deeper into that myself.
I just completed an episode. It's actually one of the longer episodes of the series with a return guest, Luís Souza from Portugal, who we had a fascinating discussion about the women in Shakespeare. And he's, of course, an Oxfordian, and he spells them out, what he calls the 5 muses of the author, and spells them out through the characters that he feels represent those women in the canon, and the biographical aspects that we find from the author's voice in his feelings towards these various women and what they represented in his life. And he very specifically talked about, you can't do that with the Stratford man. It's not possible to do that.
Right. Exactly.
And he pointed out quite astutely how many muses, famously, how many great artists, and he talked about poets, writers, composers, because he's also an accomplished composer and musician. And he named, more than 30, probably closer to 50 different names, famous names, and the women in their lives who helped influence their work. And he said, if we see this across the spectrum of the world throughout history, how is it not possible? How is it that this guy didn't have that? And if we now see that he had to have had that, who was it? Was it Anne Hathaway? Is she the great muse of the works of Shakespeare? I highly doubt it.
No, she was not educated. She signed her name with a mark. She couldn't read. I mean, maybe she could read. Some people could read, but not write. But no, she was not. She was nothing like the women of the plays. And I don't think you can see her as an influence in that regard.
I would argue,
it's a huge problem, I think.
It is, and I would argue that the Birthplace Trust is delving into this at their own peril, because it's just going to become more of a glaring example of how they, trying to have things 2 different ways. But I would argue that one of the reasons they're embracing the women of Shakespeare and making that a big deal is because they're trying to counter what has been over the last several years sort of a movement to paint Shakespeare as the, patriarchal old white guy, and he's becoming less popular in certain circles because of those types of outlooks on literature and art, and he's getting dismissed in a lot of circles. And so I think they're trying to counter that by embracing the feminine, as it were, right? To make sure they keep selling tickets and they keep drawing audiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. There's a huge push, by feminist scholars to sort of reclaim the women of the Renaissance, the overlooked women of history. So it's part of that trend. What is a little bit, I think, dishonest in what they do is they don't seem to be upfront with their visitors at the Birthplace Trust about the fact that the daughters were functionally illiterate, about the fact that Anne Hathaway couldn't sign her name. So if you're a casual visitor dropping into the birthplace or to one of their talks, I think the information they're putting forth there is fairly misleading about the women in Shakespeare's life. Even when I visited the birthplace, when you walk through the actual house, they have it laid out as though people are living there, and you see a desk with books on it and a quill and ink, as though Shakespeare's parents were highly literate people who were writing letters and reading literature, when in fact scholars over the years have acknowledged in the biographies that they were both probably fairly illiterate. So even that presentation there, without even saying anything, just were there books in that house? Probably not. I mean,
but he was an alderman of the town. Really, he was a respected town father, John Shakespeare. He held authority and position and had been selected to be representative of the people of the town.
But 7 of the men on the town council couldn't sign their names, something like that, a huge number. So you could do business in that era without being highly educated, without being able to write. And the fact, even Stephen Greenblatt says in his biography, the fact that John Shakespeare signed his name with an X, with a mark, is a significant indicator that he could not write.
I live in a small town today in 2024 modern America, and I can tell you some of the people who sit on our town council are not much better educated than that either. And so it just goes to show you that people can get chosen for positions of responsibility and representation for a lot of different reasons that have nothing to do with their mental acuity or knowledge or education or ability to make rational or good decisions for that matter. Sometimes it truly is just a popularity contest, and sometimes it's about who could spend money or self-interest, who they think is going to make decisions in the interest of their own pocketbook. And that's politics, and that's how it's always been. And I think it's so intellectually dishonest.
He was a businessman and a tradesman in town, and it was a small town, population of 1,500, 2,000. It's not like this is a significant city. So anyway, I think the Birthplace Trust, the way it communicates with visitors, is not exactly transparent.
Something that I have noticed over the years in my involvement with this issue, when we talk about the vast number of candidates, is that when you narrow down the ones that make any kind of sense at all, one of the things that I find interesting that I don't feel is talked about enough is that a number of them are all within the same circle of Elizabethan England. Many of the candidates are either related to each other by blood or by marriage. They fall into a very close, tight-knit circle around the queen and the nobility of the time. And I think that is an interesting aspect of this. Why do you feel that is? Do you feel that the reason that little circle exists is because inside that circle is maybe the answer? Or do you think that it has to do with the qualifications that we see being required in order to write the canon? What is that circle? And what do you feel about that?
Well, Elizabethan London was a much smaller place then than it is now, and the court itself was an even smaller group of people. So it's not necessarily surprising that a lot of these people were connected or knew each other. I mean, I guess just to draw the connections, let's see. Francis Bacon was cousin to Oxford by marriage. Oxford was connected then to the Earl of Derby, William Stanley, who was a candidate through Oxford's daughter's marriage, right? He married Oxford's daughter. So that's another connection by marriage. Amelia Bassano was brought up in the home of Susan Bertie, whose son Peregrine Bertie married Mary de Vere, Oxford's sister. Then Mary Sidney was, of course, another lady at court whose son married Oxford's daughter, although that was not till after Oxford's death. And I think given Mary Sidney's fierce loyalties to her brother, Philip Sidney, who was Oxford's, one of Oxford's antagonists or enemies, I'm not sure that Mary Sidney and Oxford were really allies. If anything, they might have been part of opposing factions, but of course knew each other. Marlowe moved in the circle of writers that Oxford was very interested in and supported. So yeah, is that the web we're thinking of here?
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting. I don't think that gets enough attention, and I think that by looking at all of these people, when you look at a candidate list, and then you draw the connections between certain candidates, I think that what you can now do is eliminate candidates who aren't connected to that circle or who are more tangential to that circle. Obviously the Queen.
You can connect everyone to the circle. Like Henry Neville was in the Tower with Southampton, right? So you can connect him too. Like it was such a small world. But I think I'm thinking back to some of the scholars earlier in the 20th century, who did propose a sort of a group authorship theory, for instance, in the book Seven Shakespeares, written in, I think, 1930 or so by Gilbert Slater. And he was observing then all of these connections and, suggesting that all of these people were involved in some capacity. Even J.T. Loney, thought that William Stanley, the Earl of Derby, who was married to Oxford's daughter, he suggested that he had a hand in revising some of the later plays and perhaps putting together the first folio. So I think I think scholars of the question have observed those connections over the years. But sure, in the popular discussion of the subject among people, who don't know all these figures at court, yeah, I guess those connections do sometimes get lost.
I suppose my point is that out of all those people and in all those circles, there's one giant character that doesn't fit anywhere in any of that, and it would be Stratford Will the Grain Man. Like, there's no connection whatsoever between him and any of those people. There's no chance whatsoever that he traveled in any of those circles. There's no proof that he knew any of those people or ever was even in the same room as any of those people, whereas all of the rest of them had very intimate dealings with each other on a regular basis. And so it puzzles me now how we can have an intellectually honest discussion about this and not just immediately dismiss the Stratford man as not fitting into the discussion anymore.
He is the absent center, certainly. What's interesting is that, the Lord Chamberlain's men, Shakespeare's troupe, scholars say that many of the actors in that troupe actually came from another troupe, Lord Strange's men, which was the troupe sponsored by the fifth Earl of Derby, Ferdinando Stanley. So most of the actors came from that group, the Lord Strange's men, when he was assassinated, and then the group became the Lord Chamberlain's men. So that's an immediate connection to sort of William Stanley and the Derby theory. But there's no trace of Shakespeare in that earlier group. Hemmings, Condell, I think Burbage, some of the other actors were in that earlier troupe. There's no trace of Shakespeare in any earlier acting company, which is bizarre. And frankly, Oxford was such a patron of theater and such a supporter of the arts. You would think the greatest patron of theater in that period would have had some connection with the great playwright actor. And so it's weird that there is no evidence of any communication between them.
That's a great point. And, another one that I really love is that when James comes to the crown and he famously creates what I always call the very first Shakespeare Festival in that winter of 1604. the early 1605. It's that winter season. It's the season where De Vere's daughter gets married to Sidney, and that alliance is finally forged. And I think that part of that is let's put these axes to bed and let's get these two families in line together and stop now that Oxford is gone. And, now that the new generation of De Veres and Sidneys are rising up, let's get them married and join them together. And in that season, the king famously orders 8 Shakespeare productions to be performed throughout from November to February through the whole winter. And then it's not, I think it's, 6 years later, I could be fuzzy on the actual dates there, but when Elizabeth Trentham, the Dowager Countess of Oxford, when she dies, James orders another string of this time like 12 to 14 plays by Shakespeare to be performed. So obviously you have a king who loves this playwright and loves these plays. But according to Stratfordianism, Stratford man is very much still alive. The king never calls him to court to commend him for his plays, to have him present at a single performance of these now 20 productions that he has staged through his lifetime while the quote unquote author is still alive. Meanwhile, he's commissioning Ben Jonson to write masks for the court. And Ben Jonson's at court all the time delivering these masks to the king. But, again, this giant absent hole is how come the Stratford man isn't being acknowledged or recognized by a king who obviously loves the works of Shakespeare so much?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge hole. And the records we do have from that period in the sort of the later in the 1600s often tend to put him in Stratford. He's selling malt and, doing business. He's doing business back in Stratford in that period when you would think he would be part of the sort of the busy London theater season. He doesn't actually seem to be present in London or at the court.
Well, I know one of the things that we talked about in the past is the idea of the pseudonym and how many writers throughout history have used pseudonyms. I just threw out a really famous one earlier, George Orwell. Most people have never heard of the name of Eric Arthur Blair, his true persona. In fact, I bet I could ask 1,000 people if they know George Orwell's real name, and not one would be able to say. In fact, most of them would say, wait a minute, his real name is George Orwell, isn't it? Many people do know Samuel Clemens, right? That's probably one of the most famous names we do know who wrote under the pseudonym Mark Twain. There are plenty of others throughout history, and many of them have been women, and many of them have been women for the reason that they were trying to establish a greater level of credibility in what was dominated, in a world that was dominated by men, the world of publishing, of course. Lots of worlds were dominated by men during those times period, even now. But a lot of women chose pseudonyms for that reason. And I asked you once about the idea of a book about the different women who have been forced or felt that they needed to write under a pseudonym. And I'm curious to know how you feel about that topic now, almost a year later.
Oh, yeah, I remember you raising that. I mean, I think people know that women have written under pseudonyms for a long time, so I'm not sure that would really be new information to people. And I guess if I'm just sort of rehearsing ideas that are already out there, or the history of women using pseudonyms, to me, I don't know, I guess that's not super compelling to me as a narrative idea. For me, what drives a project is some unanswered question I need to have about it. Some hook into literature or history that gets at something that we don't quite understand. And I'll give you an example. There's a wonderful book by the journalist Janet Malcolm, whom I love. She wrote a book called Alice and Gertrude, and it's about Gertrude Stein and her partner Alice Toklas, And Malcolm, they've been written about a lot, but Malcolm's sort of driving question in that book was, how did two Jewish lesbians survive Nazi-occupied France? Great question. And it becomes her way of sort of delving into their biographies again and what really happened in their lives during that period and what they did to survive. And that's something no one had really looked into before. So, I mean, I think what I'm looking for when I write a book or when I take on a project is, some burning question that I feel I need to answer or that remains unanswered to the world. So with the women using pseudonyms, I mean, sure, the history of women using pseudonyms is fascinating. And I think it's pretty well documented at this point, but I'm not sure what the burning question would be there for me to answer. I don't know. Is there a question for you that you want answered with that?
I guess it would be, I've got a frog in my throat all of a sudden. I guess it would be that what I'm not aware of, and I'm sure there are probably books out there I could go look and try to find, but I suppose a comprehensive story of some of these women and the reasons behind their choices and how it played out for them and how long they were able to keep it a secret. And then how those secrets were revealed would be really interesting to me, because I feel like it connects to this topic, right? Like what we're discovering is the secret of the Shakespeare brand was maintained so well and for so long. And it's now really, in my mind, I feel it's really blowing up and it's really getting out there. And I'd be curious to know how long some of these women were able to keep their secret and how the secret blew up, when it blew up, and the circumstances as to what happened there. There are some reverse ones that I'm aware of. Like, for instance, there's the famous topic of, did Mary Shelley actually write Frankenstein, or was it her husband? And it's a reverse. He chose to put her name on it to make it more sensational that a 19-year-old girl could write this magnificent novel. And I think there's still a lot of question about that. But that would be like a little side note, I guess, on the topic. But I would really be interested into knowing, how did these secrets get maintained? In modern times, it's a lot easier because a publisher might say to an author, we're going to give you this name and keep it a secret that you're a woman, because it'll sell more books. But it started out long before there was, publishers making money, I think. And so when it comes to, I guess I'm super interested in pseudonyms and how they've evolved, how they've developed, and why they've been used. And the reason for women has always been pretty prevalent, right?
Yeah, the use of pseudonyms over history is really interesting. All the different reasons why people have adopted them. I mean, I think it's hard for us today, to understand why someone might not want to proclaim their authorship of a work. That's a mindset that's hard for the modern mind to understand, where we always want to sort of boast about ourselves to the world, and the idea that people might actually be ashamed of having written something or feel the need to protect their reputation by taking on a pseudonym. But, we still have instances of that. There are exposés of the Trump administration written by anonymous, right? There was that book about the Clintons called Primary Colors, I think, which was published anonymously, although the journalist was later outed as, I think, Joe Klein.
That's a great example.
So there, yeah. Whistleblowers today often do so under the cover of anonymity. And I think, there's a wonderful quote from Oscar Wilde, which I love. He says, men, rarely speak the truth in their own person. He says, give a man a mask and he will tell you the truth. Which, I love, the creative freedom that you feel if you can say whatever you want and no one will know who you are. I think there's a headiness to that as a writer, which I think is probably very intoxicating. The freedom that opens up when you don't have to be worried about people who pointing out or looking for your life in your works. And that's, I'm sure that's been very fun for writers over the years to have that cover.
Well,
to say what they want to say.
The title of your book, Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies. Have you discovered throughout this journey now any other heresies or taboo subjects that you're interested in sort of diving into and scratching the surface and upturning the apple cart the way you've kind of have done with this book?
Oh, I mean, other heresies. Heresies are it's a kind of a relative notion. What's accepted by one group as heresy to another group. There's plenty of religious fodder for that kind of concept. And you even see it now in some of the ongoing discussions about the war in Gaza, between the different camps. So I don't know. I think I've dabbled enough in heresy for now. I'm not sure that I don't have any other particular taboos I feel compelled to take on. I'm more interested in, what I really loved with this last book was drawing the character portraits of the people I interviewed. That was sort of the most fun for me as a journalist. So I'm looking for a subject where I can delve into history and literature again with a burning question of some sort, like, why is the authorship question so taboo? That was my burning question with this one. But at the same time, interview some colorful characters that bring the debate to life and sort of take readers into the living rooms and lives of scholars or other people today. So
is that becoming harder to do? I mean, as we move through history and as we move into the present day and into the future, is it becoming harder to find good stories that haven't already been done, or topics that haven't already been touched on, or that can be elaborated or touched on in a different way? When you're pitching stories to your editors for the various publications that you work for, are you finding it more difficult to pitch a story and come up with a good enterprise story that's going to sell or that's going to bite, that an editor's going to say, yeah, do that, follow that?
Well, no, not really. I mean, most stories in newspapers and magazines are pegged to cultural events that are happening now, or books that are coming out. I review books that are coming out. I write about new art exhibitions. I'll be writing about the reopening of the Folger Shakespeare Library. I just reviewed a new novel that's coming out. So a lot of the culture coverage in papers is very much pegged, as they say in the industry, to what's happening right now. So, but if you want to delve into some past figure or historical event, you kind of there has to be a book coming out about it, or some new research that's been done that gives you a compelling reason to return to it. Or, sometimes it's something as simple as the anniversary of someone's birth date or death date, which becomes the occasion for revisiting them. But no, there are an infinite number of interesting stories in the world, and it's just a matter of reading and talking to people and finding them.
How have you found that various editors of magazines and newspapers that you have worked for or that you pitch work to, how have you found their reactions to your book, or if any? Have any of them ever mentioned it or not mentioned it? Has it opened doors for you? Has it closed any doors for you that you're sort of aware of but not aware of? I mean, obviously an editor's not going to go, oh no, we don't want to work with you anymore because you wrote that scandalous book. They're not going to be that open about it, I wouldn't think. But have you had any sense of what that has done for you career-wise in your pursuits since then and now moving forward?
I've continued writing for the publications that I've always written for: The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, The Economist. I'm writing for other publications as well. I have new pieces coming out in the coming months. So I don't think that it has done any, damage as perhaps the attackers were hoping. I would I don't know, I guess they were hoping I would be buried in the ground and never write again or something like that. No, I mean, people have been very interested in the book. Editors have, expressed interest in, reading it if they hadn't read it already. So it's all been good.
That's great. That's great to hear. I know because, there has there were those folks like Bate and others who came out kind of sharply, and they didn't just criticize the book, but as they almost always do, the people of that ilk, they also, personally attacked you, your writing style, your scholarship. And so I just wondered if there was any of those ripples made it to any shore, or if they just kind of all withered out the way that we would hope. And it sounds like it hasn't affected you at all.
Well, I don't think those attacks play out the way that people think they're going to, because in fact, when you launch those kinds of attacks on someone, it's more of a reflection on the writer, on the person who's writing those attacks, really, than it is on the person that they're attacking. And people who are intelligent see that. And the other thing is, I've been a journalist for 10 years now, and I have relationships with editors, and they know me, so they know my work. They know my writing, and they're not going to be swayed by some doofus launching at me. It's just noise. It's just noise. It doesn't affect their relationship with me or their personal knowledge of me.
Well, fellow Quillers, there it is.
Thank goodness.
I was really hoping that throughout the episode at some point I could tease some kind of future project out of Elizabeth, but she's holding her cards very close to her chest right now. I will tell you though, Elizabeth, I know I speak for almost everybody out there listening that we are waiting on pins and needles for the next book. So I don't want to put any pressure on you, but I think you need to start writing because we're waiting. It's like, I need to know what's going to happen to Harry Potter. And, J.K. Rowling was kicking out a book like once every year to year and a half to 2 years. So, just saying.
I hear you, Stephen. I will get right on it.
I've actually never read Harry Potter. I just used that as an example.
Never read Harry Potter?
No, I haven't. No.
What?
I know, sacrilege. My wife says that all the time. My wife is actually reading the first book with our eldest daughter now. Our eldest daughter is 10. And
that's
so
great.
She's old enough. But so what Annie's wanted to do is deliver them to Stella the way that she read them growing up, which was having to wait every year or so for a new book to come out. And I said, you realize that's not going to work, right? When you have all the books sitting right here on the shelf, Stella's not going to wait. She's not going to let you make her wait a year to read the next book. That's just not a reality.
No.
So they're trying to mitigate that together.
No, I devoured it. Yeah. No, I mean, I had to wait too as they were coming out. And I remember getting, the fourth or the fifth one the day it was released. And I did absolutely nothing that day but read that book.
That's Annie's experience too. And so she kind of wants to replicate that with Stella, of course. And I told her, there are already spoilers happening because there are kids at school that have already read them. And, some of our younger children have friends that have already read them, which I think is kind of strange because I don't know, maybe I'm a prude, but we waited till we felt Stella was ready to deal with the subject matter and really follow the story. And we got her started on some other stuff ahead of time, like Narnia and others, so that she'd be used to a long series of books kind of a thing. But some of the spoilers are already happening and it's already making Annie really sad. I said, well, you can't stop it. It's impossible. But nonetheless, the analogy stands. We're waiting. And when your next book does come out, we will be the ones who will be there buying it on the first day and voraciously consuming it without doing anything else all day, just like you were with book 6 or 7 of the Harry Potter series. Well,
that is very kind of you. I appreciate all the support. It means a lot.
In the meantime, folks, you need to go out there to your book selling sites, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Abbey Books, wherever it is that you purchase your books. Lately, I've been buying mine through Barnes & Noble because they're more reliable, because I tend to buy multiple copies of books, including Shakespeare scripts, obviously. But go to your favorite site and get your pre-orders in now. I intend to do so because I know I have a list of people who I want to put this book in their hands. I've already given a few of the hard copies away, but now it's going to make it a lot easier for me to give everybody a paperback copy. I have a cast of actors who, some who have already read it and some who need to read it. So I'm compiling my list, but you can do the same. And not only is it going to help you help explain why you're interested in this mystery and introduce others to the mystery, but it's also going to help out Elizabeth as well. And we want to support her and make sure that the bookstores want to stock this book and share it with the world. So go out there. It is Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies, Elizabeth Winkler. And I want to thank you, Elizabeth, for taking the time to join us again.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And thanks also to all your listeners who have read the book, who have left reviews of the book on Amazon and Goodreads. I'm so grateful for all the support out there. Thank you so much.
That's a great point. If you haven't already done that, please do that as well, especially if you did order from Amazon or any of those sites that require you to be a verified purchaser to put in a review. If you're a verified purchaser, then definitely go in and include that review. Just type in a few positive words. Goodreads is another one. And you can also, when you go on Goodreads, there's the ability to like other people's reviews. And that helps too. That helps bring the book up to the top. So you don't have to actually write your own review if you don't want to, but you can go in there and look at some of the reviews that some of us have put up there and click a like or a love or whatever I forget what the rating scale is there, but you can click on those and add yourself to the review as somebody who says this review was helpful to me. And that's also important too. Yeah,
that actually is a big help. There has been a bit of a push by some of the Ox frauds to do what is called review bombing, especially on Goodreads, which is a popular book review site, where they've all just like tried to go on there and tank the book with 1-star ratings. I mean, it's a problem a lot of writers struggle with, this review bombing phenomenon. But so to the extent that you're able to drop in with your feedback on the book, I'm very grateful.
That's incredible to me that people have that kind of sadness in their lives, that they have nothing better to do but to try to take someone else down through their, keyboard warrior actions. They're slacktivist. Yeah. I like to call those people slacktivists because they don't actually do anything positive in the world to change anything or make a difference. They just want to tear other things down.
Yeah.
And that's how that makes them feel like they're contributing, like they're actually doing something to make change by attacking.
I know that it's disheartening. It's very frustrating. There's one reviewer who anytime someone leaves a positive comment about the book, he then goes and attacks them for giving a positive review. I mean, it's really like harassment and bullying. But that is the internet, sadly, for better and for worse.
So counter that, gang, by going out there and doing the positive thing. One of the things that I learned early on from a mentor in my life is that it takes half of the energy, half of the stamina, and half of the character to tear something down as it does to build something up. And that's what causes these people to behave the way that they do. Well, we're going to show more stamina, more energy, and definitely more character by doing the right thing, the positive thing, and supporting those who are in our circles and who are in our lives and help build them up rather than tear them down.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you. And so there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We want to thank Elizabeth again for her time. We want to encourage you to go out there, get the book. And don't forget, you can always contact me by writing to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Visit don'tquillthepodcast.com to learn about everything Don't Quill the Messenger in nature. And until next time, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com. don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.